Events on the road to setting up the border tonight at 9 on BBC Two. Now, Politics Live with Joe Coburn.
It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. With me today, Conservative MP Andrew Bowie, Labour MP Bell Ribeiro-Addy, former Conservative advisor Anita Boateng and political editor of gal-dem magazine Moya Lothian-Mclean. Today, who do you believe?
The problem was, fundamentally, I regarded him as unfit for the job.
Some of the commentary I've heard doesn't bear any relation to reality.
Dominic Cummings also accused Matt Hancock of lying. The Health Secretary responds.
These unsubstantiated allegations around honesty are not true.
Labour says the Health Secretary should resign if he's found to have lied. We'll examine the evidence. Also today, who will replace Len McCluskey as leader of the Unite trade union? And what does it mean for Labour's finances? And President Obama's former advisor Ben Rhodes on Donald Trump, Boris Johnson and the future of democracy. Let's start with some of the headlines in the newspapers and how they covered the marathon evidence session from Boris Johnson's former chief advisor, Dominic Cummings. This is the headline in the Times newspaper. Cummings rains fire on number 10. We can also take a look at the Mirror. Tens of thousands of people died who didn't need to. And this is how The Sun has written it up. After that eye test uproar, do you need a hindsight test, Mr Cummings, referring to his trip during lockdown to Barnard Castle. My question, just to open the show, is who do you believe, Andrew, Dominic Cummings or Boris Johnson?
Well, look, obviously, I've got full faith and trust in the Prime Minister and the entire government who, for this entire process, have been working hard to try and save lives and protect our NHS. Look, you can't deny yesterday was great drama, it was great TV. It gave people around Westminster something to gossip and chat about in the bars and coffee shops last night and this morning. But out there in the real world, I think that the people of this country are much more concerned and would like us in government much more to be focused on their concerns. Their concerns right now are proceeding at pace with our incredible vaccine rollout, levelling up the country, getting this country back on track, reopening, getting the economy moving again.
Sure. Those are all the lines, Andrew Bowie, and we've heard them also from Matt Hancock to some extent in the House of Commons today. But you can't get away from the fact that Dominic Cummings was at the heart of the number 10 operation. He was Boris Johnson's right-hand man throughout the pandemic. Are you saying everything he said yesterday is a lie?
Well, I mean, I wasn't in any of those rooms that Dominic Cummings was in at the time, but I trust absolutely the Health Secretary and the Prime Minister that they have been working tirelessly for a year and a half and more with some dedicated officials to navigate their way through what has been a crisis of unprecedented proportions, along with every other government in the world, to get through this pandemic and get us back on track. And that's what we are focused on right now.
Bell, who do you believe, Dominic Cummings or Boris Johnson?
We didn't really need Dominic Cummings to know all the things that he already stated. All he did was confirm them. For example, we know that tens of thousands of people died unnecessarily. We know that we weren't properly prepared. We know that the government was giving money to their donors to carry out certain aspects like PPE contracts, etc. And we know that Boris Johnson is unfit for office. We didn't need Dominic Cummings to do it. And he's obviously completely self-serving himself, because you could see he was playing politics a bit, boosting Gove and Sunak, actually, and just making sure that his attack was directed at Boris Johnson specifically. At this stage, we're talking about what's happening throughout the country. Still, Matt Hancock is saying that all of this is completely untrue. And if Dominic Cummings has evidence, which he has said he does, it's very, very important that he brings that evidence for a thorough investigation.
Right,
something which is tantamount to manslaughter.
Right, but as you have now alluded to, there was no actual evidence. Do you accept it was very much he said, he said?
Well, as I said, we didn't need Dominic Cummings to believe some of the things that Dominic Cummings has said.
All right.
I think
so
those
you
are very
do
much out
believe
in the
what
public.
Dominic Cummings has said?
Well, if he's saying that tens of thousands of people died unnecessarily, yes, I believe that. Do I believe Boris Johnson is unfit for office? Yes, I believe that. Do I believe that Matt Hancock was probably not telling the truth about certain numbers when it comes to testing? As someone who had coronavirus myself at the time, yes, I absolutely believe that. And if he has evidence, he has to bring it forward so that it can be investigated. And ultimately, as a minister, if he has lied, he has to stand down.
Anita, who do you believe?
Well, I think I agree with Andrew that yesterday was an amazing piece of political theatre. But the thing that really struck me is I'm not sure that we learned an awful lot that was incredibly new beyond understanding the level of vitriol that Dominic Cummings holds towards certain individuals. It feels to me as though the public kind of knows what it thinks about the government's handling, that it was perhaps a little slow to lock down, but things are kind of going well with the vaccine rollout. And what became really apparent yesterday is that the government was really trying to save lives, but was making decisions without a rule book. And it shows that actually there was some pessimism around things like whether they could kind of flatten the curve or whether that was the right approach. But that broadly, the country has gotten through the bulk of the tough bits of the pandemic relatively well so far. And so I'm not sure that this is going to change many opinions. And as we've heard from Bell, people in Labour who don't like the government are going to say the government's bad. People who think the government broadly has done its best are going to continue to believe that.
Right.
So not a huge amount has changed.
That's true, isn't it, Moya? It depends where you stand politically in terms of what you think. It's interesting, though, hearing from Bell, too, that she does believe Dominic Cummings to some extent, but she knew all of this, she felt, before.
I just think it's exceedingly disingenuous to pass all of this off as old hat and information we already knew, because we might have known it, we might have heard it, but the government has been telling us something different for the entirety of the pandemic. I also think it's very disdainful to call it Westminster gossip. Tens of thousands of people have died, and according to Dominic Cummings and what we've seen, that is the direct fault of the UK government. And it seems bizarre to say that, they did their best. Well, maybe they did, but it turns out their best is terrible.
Westminster tittle-tattle is how one of your colleagues put it, and picking up on Moya's point. You said, actually, that people weren't really concerned with what was said yesterday. But actually, if you look at the BBC Live page, 5.5 million views during his testimony might suggest otherwise. They may not trust him, but they're paying attention to what Dominic Cummings is saying.
Well, it was great political theatre. It was great political drama, and everybody loves a he said, she said, or in this case, he said story to get their teeth into. But what I think that people out there want us to focus on and are more concerned about is proceeding, as I said, at pace with our vaccine rollout, getting the country back open again, getting the economy back on its feet, and continuing to drive forward with other countries in the world our efforts to defeat this awful virus.
Are you saying that none of this matters, that we should just dismiss all of that? No, that when someone like Dominic Cummings says that Boris Johnson isn't fit to be Prime Minister, that tens of thousands of people needlessly died, and then actually aims his fire at the Health Secretary for continually lying over important points, which we will get to in just a moment. Are you saying that this should all just be dismissed?
No, of course it shouldn't be dismissed, and of course it matters what somebody says in the public sphere, but I think we've got to take it as his opinion on these issues. And I'm much more inclined to believe the Matt Hancock that I know, who has worked tirelessly for a year and a half with other ministers in the Department for Health and officials to combat this virus, and the Prime Minister, who I know works day and night to get this country back on track and with the best interests of the British people at heart. That's what I believe. That's what I know is happening right now in government. And we can't dismiss, obviously, everything that Dominic Cummings said, but it is very much his opinion. And he came out yesterday very much with an agenda, and that's what he delivers.
But part of that does ally with what Dominic Cummings was saying. He talked about how Boris's, his only focus was on getting this country open, to the degree that he was negligent in his duty to protect people from the pandemic. And the Matt Hancock, we also know that Matt Hancock has fudged numbers when it comes to testing. There was the 200,000 tests just 2 weeks after we could only test 82,000 people. Throughout the pandemic, he has been accused of telling, I think Piers Morgan put it, porkies. And there's been previous incidents where he has shown he is plays fast and loose with the truth. So there is basis to these claims.
I think it's a bit rich to say that we were negligent, given that we've now delivered 60 million vaccines into the arms of British people, that we locked down 3 times at the cost of billions to the economy, but to save people's lives and to protect our NHS.
Lockdown late, and the vaccines were part of the programme that Cummings praised. He said those went right because the people in charge of that were allowed to get on with it. Did you listen to this testimony?
I listened to a couple of hours, and then I actually had to get on with my job of representing the people of West Aberdeenshire and Kincardine and working with the government to carry on delivering for the British people.
I'm going to get Bell in and put something to her, because when it comes to the evidence being given by Dominic Cummings, do you accept one of the problems is that he isn't trusted wholeheartedly, Bell, by people? There was polling done yesterday, one for the newspaper, during the session itself, which was 7 hours long, says that nearly 6 out of 10 people do not believe Dominic Cummings is trustworthy. Then, in other words, should we believe anything he said?
Well, I agree that he's not trustworthy.
Right.
And I understand why people do believe that he's not trustworthy because of his actions in the past. As a Member of Parliament, people write to me about various issues, and in the incident, particularly when he broke the rules, I had so many people writing to me, as did other Members of Parliament, saying, I've never written to my MP before, but I want to tell you how angry I am about what Dominic Cummings has done. So yes, there isn't a lot of trust, but because of what we know already, I believe that people do think that there's basis to what he said. And actually, if he says he has got substantial evidence, he should be made to put that forward so that it can be investigated properly, because this is serious. It amounts to manslaughter if this is what has happened. And him not being trustworthy is beneath that. Quite frankly, if he has evidence of everything that people already know about this disastrous government.
All right, well, we've talked briefly about Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, because much of the invective from Dominic Cummings was aimed at him. He claimed that he should have been fired for at least 15 or 20 things, and he claims Matt Hancock lied on multiple occasions. Now, we want to look at one specific claim made by Dominic Cummings about Matt Hancock, and that's the policy around care homes. Let's just show you this quote from what Dominic Cummings said. We were told categorically in March that people would be tested before they went back to care homes. We only subsequently found out that hadn't happened. Now, according to a BBC reality check, it wasn't until the 15th of April that the government said that all patients discharged from hospitals would be tested for coronavirus. By this time, an estimated 25,000 patients has been discharged to care homes. That was an utter failure, wasn't it?
Look, nobody can deny that there were mistakes made along the way. Every government around the world was dealing with a fast-moving situation and a virus that we'd never had to combat before.
And more people died than there needed to be.
There will be a full inquiry at some stage that will delve into the details of this, and no doubt every government on these islands and across the world will have made mistakes. And the Prime Minister and the Health Secretary have already acknowledged that.
People died. In New Zealand, only 22 people died because they adopted a zero-COVID approach.
Right, let's just...
I don't think comparing the United Kingdom to New Zealand is a fair comparison, given the difference in population size, in demography, in terms of how we live and do business in this country, in comparison to a small island in the middle of the South Pacific.
I'm going to interrupt both of you. I just want to stick to the issue, because, Bell, as you say, you want evidence for the claims that have been made by Dominic Cummings, and we want to look at this one particularly, because, of course, it was hugely important and very emotive. On that, Dominic Cummings is right. More people died than there needed to be. That advice wasn't changed until the 15th of April.
Look, along this entire process, the Department for Health and the entire government were working tirelessly to save lives, to protect our NHS, and all their energies were going into making sure that more people did not needlessly die than had to. Every sinew was being strained, not just by Matt Hancock, by all the other ministers in the Department for Health. And like I said, I have no doubt that at stages along the way, some mistakes were made, like there would have been mistakes made by the Scottish Government, the Welsh Government, the Northern Irish Executive, and indeed every other government around the planet in dealing with a situation we had never had to deal with before. But frankly, right now, what we should be focusing on is how we get out of this and how we continue with our vaccination programme and get the country back on track.
It's important to be accurate, though, isn't it, Bell? I'll read that quote and show viewers again. Dominic Cummings says, we were told categorically in March that people would be tested before they went back to care homes. As I said, the reality check by the BBC says that did become the policy on the 15th of April. We don't know if that private conversation took place between Dominic Cummings, Matt Hancock and the Prime Minister, and the BBC reality check cannot verify those claims. So do you accept that?
I accept that Dominic Cummings has said that he has evidence to the contrary, and I would like him to be made to produce that evidence and for it to be investigated.
But you've just said yourself that he isn't a trustworthy witness.
He isn't a trustworthy witness for a number of reasons. He's lost a lot of public confidence himself. But if he has evidence, physical evidence, and he presents it, that evidence speaks for itself, and it goes beyond his self-serving and untrustworthy nature. I think that's really, really important. 70,000 civilians died in World War II. We're looking at close to 150,000 with this pandemic. The idea that we wouldn't be looking into such claims from somebody who was so close to government at the time is unbelievable. The idea that we just call them, Westminster gossip is unbelievable. He may have scores to
let me bring in Anita, because standing back just a moment, will we ever get to the truth when it comes to claim and counterclaim, Anita, if these are private conversations about what happened during those early months in the pandemic?
I do think Jeremy Hunt, the chair of the Health Select Committee in the House today, kind of made the point that these allegations aren't so serious that we really do need to consider them once the evidence has been produced. I do think the challenges around care homes is something that was seen across Scotland and in Wales. And so there is some merit in us looking back and understanding exactly where that fell down. But what I would say is that Labour's approach of constructive opposition after the fact is pretty extraordinary. Bell cites the example of New Zealand, as Andrew said, not quite the same international global hub with an incredibly mobile population with entirely different demographics. But there are many instances through the pandemic where Labour could have been saying, well, look at South Korea, why aren't we doing X or Y? And instead they ran from pillar to post, kind of making up and flip-flopping on their own opposition throughout this crisis. So I really think there are lessons for the government, certainly, but there are lessons for Labour, who didn't have to deal with the actual pandemic, but simply should have been providing constructive ideas.
We have not had to deal with the actual pandemic. We have not presided over the deaths of nearly 150,000 people. But I think you're absolutely wrong on the point that we haven't opposed the government on many of these actions. Labour members of Parliament, and there are many, many Labour members of Parliament, have consistently made the case for a different approach when it came to COVID. Have consistently made the case about things such as no, not after the event. In my case, it's certainly not after the event. If you're talking about a particular Labour MP in general, please do raise their name and we can look into that.
But we could look at the official Labour position, which was anti-lockdown, then pro-lockdown, then anti-keeping the schools open, then pro-keeping the schools open, then anti-closing the borders, then pro-closing the borders. You flip-flopped and moved around so many times during this entire pandemic. I'm very grateful that the Labour Party are not the party of government right now.
Let her respond. Go on,
what
Bell.
I would say is that the Labour front bench has tried to be constructive, and I'm specifically saying the Labour front bench, and you will understand why. They've tried to be constructive in the way in which they behave. They adopted an approach at some point of attempting to, support the government where they had to.
Right.
In my personal opinion, that wasn't always the right thing to do. They have believed the government when they've said, here is the science. Unfortunately, we've since found that, some things have been fudged in terms of what the government have presented in terms of the science and the facts and the figures. And I think that's been unfortunate. But to say that we haven't mounted an opposition is completely unfair. And to say that that is the view right across the Labour Party is also completely unfair.
Hang on. I want to bring Moya in on the care homes, this particular claim that we have highlighted. Having listened to the claim and the BBC Reality Check response, what's your view?
Well, my view on the care homes is the evidence was right in front of us. We lived through it. We saw that people were being discharged into care homes without being tested. We heard the testimonies from people in care homes.
But was Matt Hancock lying?
I would say I think Dominic Cummings might be telling the truth on this. But I'd also just like to pick up...
What evidence have you got?
I'd just like to pick up on what was just said about South Korea, about Labour not opposing correctly. So you can I just get this straight, Andrew? You are saying that if Labour had... Please let me finish.
Don't shout at each other, but go on, Moya. Make your statement and then we'll come back to it.
You said to Bell, if Labour had constructively opposed the government, we wouldn't have had so many deaths. So you admit that there was something to oppose.
No,
but that was the inference that you and Anita were both making.
I said that Labour had flip-flopped and changed the position throughout this entire pandemic. But a second ago, you said you suspect that Dominic Cummings was telling the truth over whether Matt Hancock lied. What evidence have you got for that? At all?
We lived through it. We watched people being...
But Moya, the important thing is we couldn't verify
the specific claim.
whether that conversation was actually made, whether it took place, and whether indeed Matt Hancock did lie July, in March, saying that everybody who left hospital would be tested before they went back into a care home.
But Moya's point is valid, because you see, having spoken to people that work in the care homes, the families of those that have been in the families of the COVID bereaved families, a lot of them have evidence to the contrary of what is being said here. It is clear that people are being directly put into care. So, all of that evidence exists. It seems at the moment that the government does not want to go and look for it, because obviously it puts them in a bad light. And then to pass that back onto Labour, who I repeat, are not the government of the day. It is the Conservative Party that's presided over. And this is not about points. It's just making a simple point. You cannot blame your opposition for what you have done. All
right, we're going to leave it there because we're going to talk to the BBC's political correspondent, Ian Watson. He's here to talk to us about Unite, the trades union, and its leadership race. But first of all, we now have the date for that important Batley and Spen by-election, Ian.
We do indeed, Joe. It's going to be on July the 1st, and this is an absolutely crucial by-election for Labour and indeed for Sir Keir Starmer, having already lost, of course, Hartlepool and suffered very disappointing results in local elections in many parts of England. Now, the Labour candidate is going to be Kim Leadbeater. She is the sister of the former MP Joe Cox, who, of course, was murdered back in 2016, and she is emphasising her credentials as a community campaigner rather than a party political figure. But were she to lose, it's Keir Starmer's leadership that would come under even greater scrutiny. And in fact, I'm told one of the reasons that the by-election will be as soon as the beginning of July is that Labour simply couldn't afford to fund a longer campaign over the summer. And as you say, I've been talking to the 4 candidates who are seeking to take over the biggest funder of the Labour Party, which is the Unite Union, seeking to take over from Len McCluskey. And what is interesting is that one of the candidates, Howard Beckett, has already said that he'd be calling on Keir Starmer to resign if Batley and Spen is lost. But he was also suggesting that he could put financial as well as political pressure on the Labour leadership. And another candidate, Sharon Graham, who takes a high-profile position in many of the unions' industrial disputes. She has said that Keir Starmer has been failing working people, and she said that funding for the Labour Party wouldn't be guaranteed.
Ian, we don't seem to have that particular clip, so tell us about the other candidates and what they've been saying about funding.
Well, let me tell you a little bit more about what Howard Beckett was saying in that case. But he was saying if the party continued its rightward drift, then from his point of view, he said that the party shouldn't get any more funding from him, and he'd be suggesting to the executive of the union that the party look again at affiliating to Labour. Now, that's worth more than £1 million a year of guaranteed funding to the Labour Party. The union gave £3 million to the Labour Party in the run-up to the last election. So this is pretty high-stakes stuff. As far as Sharon Graham's concerned, she was saying there should be no blank cheque for the Labour leadership either. Now, Unite doesn't always live up to its name, Joe, I have to say, so there are different views amongst the candidates, as you might expect. There are also different views amongst candidates who put themselves on the left of the union, because another of the candidates, Steve Turner, I say he's on the left, so much so he was actually the campaign manager for Len McCluskey in the previous union contests. But he says, although he's got differences with the Labour leadership, he's not going to fall out over money. And Gerard Coyne, who is the 4th candidate, he unsuccessfully challenged Len McCluskey last time. He's much more supportive of Keir Starmer's leadership, and he says it's simply wrong for anyone in the union to suggest that, in effect, they would use their financial clout to determine Labour Party policy.
When will we know the winner?
Well, not for a little while yet. The nominations close in just over a week. Members will vote over the summer. The winner will be announced in the last week in August. But that, of course, is not long before Labour's annual conference in the autumn, not long before the TUC conference either. And I think there's going to be some anxious moments, quite frankly, in the Labour leader's office. But if you want to hear the views of these candidates, not just on Labour Party funding, but on what they mean as well for the more than 1 million members of Unite who will be voting in that contest, well, we'll be setting out some of their wider views on the BBC News website if you go to the politics page.
Right, thank you very much. Ian Bell, you're a member of Unite. Who will you be backing?
I am a proud member of Unite. I haven't quite decided yet, but it is so important that we retain that link with our unions. The Labour Party is nothing without its trade unions that we were founded from. And I think it, in terms of the funding, it definitely keeps us honest. the funding that we get from our unions, from ordinary members of the Labour Party, essentially through their levy, it is so key, because it means we don't get caught up in the kind of sleaze incidents that we know that the Conservative Party often get caught up in, because this money is coming directly from activists.
All right, well, I better let you respond to that, Andrew, before I go back to this issue of funding.
Well, I think Bell's absolutely right. The Labour Party are nothing without the trade unions. They certainly wouldn't have any money without the trade unions, and that's where we know the power lies. But it's quite remarkable listening to Bell and
the same
others.
with donors, I suppose, to the Conservative Party.
Yeah, well, you could, I suppose. But I mean, it's quite remarkable listening to Ian there and listening to Bell speak. And Unite, yes. It's very interesting to see the Labour Party under Keir Starmer at war with itself. And this is a party that's not united in itself. And if you can't unite the Labour Party behind its leadership, how on earth does he ever expect to be able to unite the country behind a premiership? So I think that Keir Starmer has got some serious issues that he has to address within his Labour family. And I think this is going to be a very interesting election to see who becomes General Secretary of the United.
Well, it's good to know you'll be watching it so closely, Andrew, in that case. Bell, you mentioned the issue of funding. So you're not comfortable with the idea that any of the candidates could be talking about or promoting cutting off financial links with the Labour Party?
I think it would be massively detrimental for the Labour Party. But at the end of the day, as a trade unionist myself, I understand that whilst we are affiliated, it is an external trade union and it has to act in the interests of its members. Our link not only keeps us honest in terms of funding, but it keeps us honest in terms of policies. And those policies within the Labour Party have to be reflective of all of our members and our affiliated members. So it's not unusual for Unite to, let's say, well, why doesn't the Labour Party support us in this or support us in that? I think that's fair enough. All right. However, it would be disastrous, and I certainly hope that does not happen.
We're going to return to a story from earlier in the week. Welsh MP Rob Roberts faces a 6-week suspension from Parliament after an independent panel found he sexually harassed a member of his staff. Now, he's also lost the Conservative Party whip, but due to a loophole in parliamentary procedure, he won't face a recall petition, which could have potentially allowed his constituents to trigger a by-election. The Leader of the House of Commons, Jacob Rees-Mogg, has been addressing this issue today.
Following a case of this severity, in which it would be honourable for a member to stand down after the withdrawal of the whip, we need to look at whether the process is striking the right balance between independence, protecting the confidentiality of complainants, and ensuring consistent outcomes across different types of conduct case. I can therefore confirm to the House that I have asked the chairman of the independent expert panel for his views on whether changes should be made to the current process to enable recall to be triggered.
Right. Well, should those changes happen?
Well, I think it's very good news that the Leader of the House is having those meetings. This is a relatively new system that we have in place in the House. It's a very positive step that we now have this independent complaints and grievances system. And I'm glad that it did its job and that the MP in question will now face a 6-week suspension.
Yeah, but beyond that, we heard Boris Johnson yesterday, who described the removal of the party whip as appropriate condign punishment. Is it really appropriate and enough?
Well, I think it was absolutely necessary that the whip was withdrawn. He now no longer sits as a Conservative MP. And I think it's right that we now look at whether we can bring in steps that we do remove MPs from sitting as MPs as a result of being found guilty of something as serious as Rob has been found guilty of in this case.
Right, and in terms of recall, should that loophole be closed? Should it be made retrospective?
There are some incredibly complex procedural issues to deal with here, but I think in the principle, yes.
Anita?
Yes, I think in principle this does show that something perhaps that wasn't anticipated when the recall rules have been drawn up ought to be looked at again. And I think it's right that the Leader of the House and others take this really seriously and properly review whether it needs to go further. But it is good news, I think, that the independent panel, this is one of the first cases that they've looked at, has come back so unequivocally.
Mm-hmm. Bell?
Yeah, I would have to agree. It's not a matter of party politics at all. The loophole should absolutely be closed, and we should be doing more on such issues. It's not right that as members of the House of Commons that we are not held to account in the strictest way. We are lawmakers and we shouldn't be lawbreakers and face no consequences for it.
Do you welcome this move, Moya?
But I not welcome this move. But I think you know, it's the Houses of Parliament, the House of Commons, it's the most powerful sort of halls in the country. If they're not setting any sort of example for how to deal with sexual violence in the workplace particularly, what kind of world would we be in? But I think it needs to go further, and there needs to be more education. I've read accounts by young women, because there's not much data on young men and staffers, especially within Westminster, who speak about the low-level culture of just sexual harassment. And I think that, in these cases, when it's this level of severity, it's brilliant that they're finally taking action, but the whole culture needs to be once more examined. We had the 2017 Westminster expose. We need to look at what further can be done to prevent this in the first place, rather than the retrospective acting after the fact.
I mean, Jacob Rees-Mogg said the honourable thing would be for Rob Roberts to step down. Do you think he should?
Yes, I think he should. I think that is the honourable thing, and I think he owes it to not just the victim in this case, but to his constituents to stand down and to let them have a chance to elect somebody that they would be proud to have as their Member of Parliament.
Right. Is there anything else that can be done, though, Bell? I mean, Jess Phillips, your colleague, they were looking at alternative ways to force a recall. Is that what should happen if, indeed, those meetings don't bear fruit?
Absolutely. We shouldn't let a loophole stop us from finding alternative routes to make sure that justice is done. He absolutely cannot stay a Member of Parliament, and it looks absolutely terrible. So if there is something that we can find, I'd be in full support of that. Right.
Well, if that were to happen, of course, it could then trigger a by-election in Delyn. But anyway, we will bring you more news on that as we have it. We've been covering this story all week. We're now joined, or will be joined, by Ben Rhodes, who is former senior advisor to Barack Obama, author and host of the Pod Save the World podcast. And you've written a book, too, to add to the list, After the Fall, Being American in the World We've Made. Broadly speaking, am I right in saying it's about where America is at the moment and how it got there? Can you chart it for us briefly?
Yeah, I mean, briefly, it's actually about where America is and where the world is. When I was spit out of the White House after 8 years in the 2016 election and felt a lot of shock and disorientation, what I did is I traveled. I traveled around the world, and I found that the same thing was happening everywhere. And the origin of the book for me was going to Hungary and speaking with a young Hungarian oppositionist and asking him, hey, how did you go from being a democracy to essentially an autocracy in a decade? And he said, well, it started with Viktor Orban getting elected on a right-wing populist backlash to the financial crisis in 2008. He then redrew the parliamentary districts, packed the courts with conservative right-wing judges, enriched some cronies who finance his politics. They bought up the media and created a right-wing propaganda machine, and they wrapped it all up in a nationalist bow of us versus them politics, the them being immigrants, being liberal elites, being Muslims. And I'm listening to him thinking, well, he could be describing the United States over the last 10 years. There's something here to this. And I ended up talking to Hong Kong protesters, to Alexei Navalny, looking at these strains of authoritarianism, nationalism that really, of course, came back to the United States as well.
Right. Well, Viktor Orban is in Downing Street tomorrow. Listening to that, why is he here? Why is he being welcomed by Boris Johnson on the basis of...
Deny that there are significant and serious differences between ourselves and the way that Viktor Orban conducts himself and his government. But it's absolutely the right thing that the Prime Minister of this country meets the leaders of other countries. Let's not forget that Viktor Orban sits as a member of the European People's Party alongside such people as Angela Merkel and other centre-right leaders within Europe. So it's completely normal and natural in the diplomatic world for Prime Ministers, Presidents and other heads of government and heads of state to meet each other and discuss shared common values and goals. That's not to say, however, that we in any way endorse the violations of human rights, nor hit the way that he's been conducting himself in government over the last 10 or 12 years.
Right, Ben?
Well, look, I am sympathetic to the need to meet with people of different perspectives. I do think, though, and I hold ourselves to account even in the Obama years, there needs to be a tougher line taken against people like Orban. And I'm not sure that giving him any kind of embrace is the right approach. He's at the vanguard of a very disruptive, I think, far-right brand of politics that is not democratic, that is blocked in the European Union context action against autocrats, action in support of democracy. And what concerns me is, he's basically tapped into a very old school nationalist brand, kind of a blood and soil nationalism that really, Britain has stood against. And so while I get the need to speak to people like Viktor Orban and people who you have differences with, I don't think I would characterize it as us wanting to share common values. I think, if anything, Viktor Orban has kind of threatened the values that the US and the UK and the EU stand for. And so hopefully Boris Johnson delivers that message in his meeting.
Right. I mean, you talk about grievance-fuelled nationalism to what's happened to some extent in the States and in countries like Hungary. Do you think that applies in any way here with Boris Johnson and the government?
Yeah, absolutely. And it applies in the US, the UK, Europe. It's happened around the world. And there's a reason it's happened around the world. And look, some of it, I think, has to be understood. That you had a process of globalization that people felt was unfair, that people felt was unequal, and that people felt was encroaching on their traditional identities. And I had to wrestle with that. And I think the financial crisis really removed the bottom. The bottom fell out underneath people's feet. And I understand, therefore, and I think people like me who are on more the progressive end of the spectrum have to understand that in some people that created a longing for a more traditional sense of identity, whether you're living in Northern England or whether you're living in different parts of the United States here. But at the same time, I do think that we have to understand that longing for that form of identity, that reaction to where globalization has gone wrong, should not lead us to chuck out the democracy with the things that we don't like. And that's where I think in my book, I try to find solidarity in the stories of people around the world, in places like Hong Kong, in places like Russia, in places like Hungary, and of course in the United States, who are trying to push back against this trend of authoritarianism and nationalism.
Bell, what do you make of that?
Well, I absolutely agree. And I can see a situation where we are moving towards that increasingly authoritarian agenda. If you just look at what's been announced in the Queen's speech, a voter ID, which is essentially voter suppression, a continued rollout of the Policing Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, which would actually infringe on our human right to protest, and increasing enforcement of anti-trade union laws, all of those things that make us a democratic society seem under threat increasingly.
Right. Let me bring the others in. Andrew, you respond to that first.
Well, frankly, that's nonsense. We are one of the greatest defenders of democracy, freedom and liberty in the world, and people look to us across the world as a beacon of light in countries where they do not have the same rights, nearly as the same rights as they have. We do have grievance-fuelled nationalism in the UK, though, but you won't find it in the UK government. I think you'll find it more at the door of the Scottish government under Nicola Sturgeon in Edinburgh.
Moya?
That was an interesting dig at the end. I mean, I think I have to say that nationalism is on the rise. And I would agree with Ben that it comes from a sense of communities being uprooted, people losing sort of like the grip on what made them proud of their areas. But I would say that comes far from 10 years of austerity and a stripping back of facilities and resources within these communities. You can't build these places unless you have this funding. And 10 years of Tory rule has taken this funding away. And now they're blaming it on, this spectre of immigration or the left, the loony left doing things. But it's more to do with the strength of local communities being undermined by a lack of funding. And that's why we keep talking about things like the Red Wall and having no money and the poverty levels there. So I think let's look to our own government for the source of the nationalism and perhaps their campaigns such as Brexit.
Anita?
Absolutely astounded at what I'm hearing. I could genuinely just heard a Labour MP say that the grievance-fuelled nationalism in the north is behind what's happening in this country. I honestly cannot believe that.
Just one moment, Anita, you can't actually see me, so I didn't say that. So you might want to correct yourself.
No, you agreed with what Ben Rhodes said, and Ben Rhodes said that we were seeing some grievance-fuelled nationalism in the north of this country, and I just don't believe that's accurate. I think what we're actually seeing is, when you look at what happened in Hartlepool, for instance, the disenfranchisement and the falling away of the Labour vote happened back in 2005. That's where it had its roots. So this idea that this is all fueled by either the economic crisis or by austerity, as Moya said, or
by the economic crisis.
It's just a very convenient narrative that doesn't address the ways in which Labour is disconnected from the working class.
Absolutely right.
Right.
I'm talking about Labour.
Well, hang on. Let me get Ben to respond. Let me get Ben to respond to what he's heard there, particularly from Anita. There are a couple of things, Ben. Do you think progressive parties forgot how to talk to voters, to talk to the public, that actually sort of predated to some extent the financial crash that you use as that major event?
I'm not sure it predates it. I think progressive parties have challenges in the sense that the kind of more traditional nationalist, and I would say right-wing story is a pretty easy story to tell. It's kind of the oldest story in politics. There's an us versus them component to it. And we do, I think, see in the US and the UK these cultural issues that fit naturally into that story. I think what progressives have to do that is difficult, and I think Barack Obama was good at this, he was better at this than a lot of other politicians in the US context, is framing progressive change, the advancements of more rights, more opportunities to more people inside of our countries, as something that does not have to be a complete rejection of the past, of traditional identity. Obama would frame it in the US as the natural extension of the American story. The validation of what America was created to be is this sense of progressive change, extending more rights and opportunities to more people, so that you're telling a story that a lot of people can feel like they are a part of. I think that is always a challenge for progressives, because I think rightly, as someone who thinks of myself in the American context as a progressive, rightly we see injustice in society and we want to change that injustice. But we have to build the coalitions necessary to do that. And that requires a story that has a place for the biggest possible coalition. Right.
But do you then think the election of Joe Biden following Donald Trump signals an end to what you see as a descent into nationalism?
No, absolutely not. Because we learned on January 6th, when there was a violent insurrection at the United States Capitol, we are not out of the woods. After a violent insurrection on the United States Capitol in the United States, the Republican Party has embraced the pretext for that insurrection, which is the big lie that Donald Trump had somehow won our election. And what I wrestle with in the book, as Americans, we have to face the fact that we've been the dominant superpower in the world for 30 years, and here we are. And what we need to do is somehow figure out a way as Americans to have an identity in which capitalism is about something more than just making money. Right. National security is about something more than subjugation. Our technology platforms are about enlightening people and not becoming the perfect tools of disinformation and division and even surveillance in the Chinese context.
Right. Well, Bell, what can Labour learn from Joe Biden's victory?
Well, I think they can certainly learn about working right across the party. One thing that I would say that Joe Biden has done is following obviously the race for him to become the candidate for his party. He reached across to loads of others across the party and to the left of the party and looked and worked with them actually to design some of the policies that are the most popular that he has to date. And I think that's made a massive difference. People like to, in some ways, the media certainly like to fetishize disunity within the Labour Party. Right. And what I would say that the Labour Party is a family. We don't always necessarily agree, as I'm sure people don't with their own families, but working together we can achieve great things. And I think that we need to listen to everybody right across the party. That's going to make a difference in terms of reaching out to our communities.
Ben Rhodes, thank you very much for joining us and entering into the discussion. Anita, just to pick up, though, yes, Boris Johnson won a big election in 2019, but to some extent he's done it by wearing lots of Labour's clothes. Can he continue to do that?
Well, I think that Ben talked about progressives believing in spreading opportunity. And I really think that that is a message that is resonating with newfound voters for the Conservatives across the country. It really is about opportunity. It's about investment outside of what is typically seen as the economic hubs of London. I don't consider that to be a left-wing policy position. And I believe that we can only get the best from people in this country when we invest in them. And that's what the Conservatives will continue to do. And Labour will continue to be adrift, accusing people who vote Conservative of nationalism or calling this a nationalist government.
Mm-hmm. Moya?
We don't accuse
Hang on, Belle. I'm going to just get Moya in now because we haven't heard from her. Go on.
That's okay. I mean, I agree. I do think that it shouldn't just be a left-wing position to invest in communities. What I would want to see, though, is whether there is a gap between the rhetoric that the Tories are saying about investing in these communities and whether that actually makes a material difference on the ground. So far, we've seen a lot of talk of these funds happening, but the stats about poverty, especially in northern areas, don't quite back up that has taken root yet. So I'd want to see that happen. I'd also want to see things like sick pay increase. We were talking about the pandemic. Anyway, the point is...
Oh, it's all we've got time for. I'm so sorry to interrupt you. From all of us here, bye-bye.